Hello everyone, this is The Shadow, and I'm here today to talk about the two TV series that are currently running about Sherlock Holmes. That is, Sherlock and Elementary. Now, this isn't going to be a ranking review. I'm not going to come out in favor of one series over the other. And there are two reasons for this. First of all, if you've made it to my review and you've heard of either of these shows, then you're probably already well aware of the feud that's going on between the fans of them. There's no need for me to add to it. Second of all, I really don't want to get into the whole my Sherlock could beat up your Sherlock game. I'm a fan of the character, I'm a fan of both series, and more importantly, I think there's a place for both of them on TV right now. So this is just going to be a comparison, and if you do happen to be listening to this to decide what you want to watch, then hopefully there will be enough information there for you to make your decision. And out of respect for you, this will be a spoiler-free review. Also, to avoid confusion, from here on out, when I say Sherlock, I'll be talking about the TV series only, and if I say Holmes, or maybe Sherlock Holmes, then I'm talking about the character. Well, let's get started then. As I said, I'm guessing you're familiar with these shows, at least enough to know what they're about. But in case you're not, let me give you a brief rundown. Sherlock is a modern-day reimagining of the original story set in London in the early 2010s, involving cases based, albeit very loosely, on those by Doyle himself. It's a sort of spiritual successor to co-head writer Stephen Moffat's previous work on Jekyll, if you've ever seen that. It stars Benedict Cumberbatch as Sherlock Holmes in what appears to be his breakout role, although you may remember him as William Carey in The Other Boleyn Girl. Dr. Watson is played by Martin Freeman, who played Arthur Dent in the ill-fated movie version of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy a few years ago. And later this year he'll be playing The Hobbit in The Hobbit. Sherlock is currently on break, and its third season should air sometime next year on the BBC. American viewers might be able to catch it as a rerun on PBS. Elementary is also a modern-day reimagining of the canon, this time set in New York and with entirely new cases so far. And here's the only advice I'm going to give you, so let's get this out of the way. If you're alright with the modernization of Sherlock Holmes, but you want something that's a little bit more accurate to the original, then Sherlock is the way to go for you, because Elementary takes far more liberties. More on that later. Elementary stars Johnny Lee Miller, who you may remember as Sick Boy from Trainspotting, and as Dr. Joan Watson we have Lucy Liu, who, and I will probably mangle this name, so please forgive me, O-Ren Ishii from Kill Bill Volume 1. Elementary currently airs on CBS on Thursday nights. Let's start with Holmes himself. Of the two, Cumberbatch plays a version of the character who may seem more recognizable to most viewers. He's logical to the point of coldness, caring, in the beginning at least, only about proving that he's clever in solving the case. He's arrogant, having little patience for anyone he feels is inferior to him, read everyone, and he makes sure that they know it. He's also easily the smarter of the two Holmes. When he makes a deduction, they almost always explain it, and it usually adds up, both in the conclusion and how he reaches it. While there's occasionally some bad writing regarding his deductions, most notably the solution to the museum mystery in the episode The Great Game, and some of the details regarding the code he breaks in A Scandal in Belgravia, there aren't too many cases of him being right just because Sherlock Holmes gets to be right in his own series. He's just that good. However, I do think they play up some of his characteristics too much. Yes, Doyle's Holmes was arrogant, but he was rarely ever rude, which is something this Holmes almost invariably is. And this only gets worse in the second season, where he also becomes more of a petulant child, albeit mainly in the first episode. Doyle's Holmes, though described once as a computer, wasn't uncaring either. True, he generally cared more about his puzzles than he did people, but he wasn't the sociopath that this Holmes describes himself as. This is a man who is about ready to beat a man with a riding crop for wronging his client in a case of identity. That's not a man without feelings for his fellow humans. The writers use the excuse that these are the early days for Holmes, the sort of Holmes begins, so he hasn't had Watson around to influence him for the better. But while his character has developed over 2 seasons, I really can't see him becoming a man who cares about people in general. What it comes down to is that he's too much like House. And yes, I'm aware that House is based on Holmes, but I think we have a clear case of circular inspiration on our hands. That being said, it really is hard to complain about this because he's just that much fun to watch. I also have to give it something of a pass because I have a feeling that if Doyle were writing the character today, he'd be writing it much the same way. He's a hero of our time. Also, I've said before that Sherlock is closer to the original canon, and that's true, but it isn't always a good thing. There are a couple of places where the show is hurt by this, and both of them involve Holmes. The first is with our first real meeting with him, where we see him beat a corpse with his riding crop to see how the bruises form after death. This, of course, is lifted from a study in Scarlet where he's said to do the same thing. However, it worked there because back then the science of forensics was just beginning to be understood, and even if Holmes had read about similar experiments, it wouldn't have been out of place for him to test them himself. Today it doesn't work because the science is understood enough that Holmes wouldn't need to waste his time conducting experiments like that. He'd busy himself testing new theories. I've heard the explanation that here Holmes was testing it because he preferred his own results to those of others, and that makes sense, but there's no indication in the story that it's true, leaving it to the realm of speculation. The second is his explanation as to why he doesn't know the Earth revolves around the sun. His mind is his hard drive, and he deletes everything he doesn't need. There is absolutely no reason why, in this century, a scientific man like Holmes would still believe something like that. Science has marched on since the 1800s, and Holmes would have kept up with it. It's interesting to note that Elementary has a similar scene, and while it's still ridiculous, it works a little bit better. When Holmes tells Watson this, Watson says, "The brain doesn't even work that way," to which he replies, "Mine does." This leaves it up to the audience to decide whether he's just being stubborn or if maybe his brain really does work differently, while still acknowledging real science. These two scenes create an inconsistency in Holmes' knowledge base in Sherlock. He doesn't know that the Earth revolves around the sun, but we're expected to believe that he knows, off the top of his head no less, the departure schedule of every plane in Britain. It stretches belief. To be fair, though, Doyle's Holmes was also pretty inconsistent in terms of knowledge, so maybe this is just a subtle in-joke that I'm not getting. Finally, there is also an inconsistency in how much Holmes understands human emotions. There are times when he's clearly very knowledgeable about it, and able to use it to his advantage. Like when he pretends to be a grieving friend to get information, or when he uses a woman's crush on him to get her to help him. But there are other times when he has to have Watson explain things to him. It's interesting to watch, but it doesn't ring quite true. Moving on to Elementary, Miller's Holmes is a study in contrast to Cumberbatch's. He's the less competent of the two. His deductions aren't bad, but they're less spectacular and a bit more tenuous. At first I thought this might be a deliberate attempt at realism, especially since Holmes here says not everything is deducible. However, at the end of the episode, he's able to predict the outcome of a baseball game. Somehow. It seems to be a case of uneven writing. However, Miller's Holmes commits a far graver sin in terms of Holmesian literature. He makes theories without full facts and accuses suspects accordingly. While Doyle's Holmes was occasionally led astray and made mistakes, he was also very careful not to voice his theories until he was certain he was right. To a certain extent, this is a flaw held by most Sherlock Holmes adaptations, because what are you going to fill the rest of the episode with when Holmes solves the mystery before the first commercial runs? However, it becomes more noticeable in Elementary when coupled with Holmes's downgraded abilities. I suppose this could be a deliberate attempt at preventing him from being a boring, invincible hero, but I think the writers need to work better at finding a balance like Sherlock does. That being said, I'm happy to say this got much better between the pilot and the second episode, so I have high hopes for this series. One thing I really like about Elementary is how it fits Holmes into the modern world. The show acknowledges that forensic science is now commonly used, instead of largely ignoring that fact like Sherlock does. They've still made him special, but in a different way. Now it's not that he can do things the police can't, it's that he can do them faster. I've said before that Miller's Holmes was more human, and that makes for a refreshing change. He still knows that he's cleverer than everyone else, and sometimes he lets either his ego or his desire to solve a case get in the way of good form. But this is accidental. He seems to be a generally compassionate person. However, again, there's a downside to this as well. He's prone to his own temper tantrums, worse ones in some cases than that of his counterpart. Though at least he has the decency to feel ashamed of them, an emotion that Cumberbatch's Holmes is still learning. There is one final thing I need to address before we move on, and this is bound to elicit some cries of blasphemy from Holmes fans. Miller's Holmes has sex. With prostitutes, no less. This will annoy both fans who think he's either a sexual or deliberately celibate and shouldn't have sex with anyone, and the fans who think he's gay and should only be having sex with Watson. However, the character remains properly clinical about the whole thing, saying he only does it because his mind and body require it, and as long as it remains that way, I don't personally have a problem with it.